He wrote the dream on a crumpled paper, and what he read made a Harvard atheist break down in front of 20,000 people. Professor Daniel Westbrook, the most celebrated atheist intellectual in America, stood frozen at the podium, his prepared speech about the dangers of religious delusion forgotten, as he stared at the homeless man who had somehow made his way onto the stage. The man's clothes were torn, his hair matted, his face marked by years of hard living on the streets of Cambridge. But his eyes burned with an intensity that made the professor's chest tighten with something he had never experienced before. Hello, friends in faith. Welcome back to the Vault of Faith channel. Peace and grace to you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. How are you today? May you be healthy, joyful, and filled with God's blessings. Please support us by clicking like, comment, share, and subscribe. Let's dive into the story. The autumn wind whipped through the stadium as Professor Westbrook tried to process what was happening. He had spent 30 years building his reputation as Harvard's most uncompromising voice against faith, religion, and what he called the psychological crutches that weak minds use to avoid reality. His books had topped bestseller lists. His debates had destroyed the careers of prominent theologians. Students traveled from across the world to hear him systematically dismantle every argument for the existence of God. Today's lecture was supposed to be his masterpiece. The Harvard Humanist Society had organized this massive gathering to celebrate the launch of his latest book, The Final Delusion: Why Faith is Humanity's Greatest Enemy. The stadium buzzed with anticipation as some of the brightest minds in academia filled the seats. Television cameras captured every angle. Social media was alive with commentary from his followers who viewed him as a prophet of reason in an age of superstition. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment when security guards rushed toward the stage, shouting about an intruder. The homeless man had somehow slipped past every barrier, every checkpoint, every layer of protection that surrounded the most exclusive academic event of the year. He moved with purpose, clutching that piece of paper like it contained the secrets of the universe. Professor Westbrook's first instinct was to call for security, to have the man removed immediately. This was his moment of triumph, his intellectual coronation. He would not allow some deranged street person to derail everything he had worked for. But something in the man's eyes stopped him. There was no madness there, no desperation, no plea for money or attention. Instead, there was a profound sadness mixed with an inexplicable hope that made the professor's words catch in his throat. The crowd grew restless. Students whispered among themselves, wondering if this was some kind of planned demonstration. The television cameras swiveled between the professor and the intruder, capturing every second of the unexpected drama. Social media exploded with speculation and commentary. This was either going to be the most memorable lecture in Harvard's history or the most embarrassing moment of Daniel Westbrook's career. The homeless man stopped just 3 feet from the podium. His breathing was labored, as if he had run for miles to reach this place. His hands shook as he held the crumpled paper, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Professor Westbrook," he said, and the stadium's sound system carried his words to every corner of the massive venue. "I have something you need to hear." The professor's mind raced through his options. He could have security remove the man immediately. He could use this moment to demonstrate his intellectual superiority by calmly dismantling whatever religious nonsense the man was about to spout. He could turn this interruption into a teaching moment about the psychological delusions that drive desperate people to seek meaning in meaningless experiences. But something deeper held him back. In 47 years of life, Daniel Westbrook had never experienced a moment of genuine uncertainty. He had built his entire identity on the bedrock of absolute certainty that the universe was nothing more than atoms and void, that consciousness was merely an evolutionary accident, and that death was the final period at the end of existence. He had never met a question he could not answer, never encountered a mystery he could not solve through reason and logic. Yet as he looked into the homeless man's eyes, he felt something crack inside his chest. It was not doubt exactly. It was something far more unsettling. It was the recognition that this moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced, that the next few minutes would somehow change everything he thought he knew about reality. The man's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Last night I had a dream, and in that dream, I was told to come here, to this place, to share something with you that would change your life forever." The professor's jaw clenched. This was exactly the kind of delusional thinking he had spent his career combating. Dreams, visions, divine revelations, they were all manifestations of psychological instability, evolutionary misfires that had somehow persisted in the human brain despite their obvious irrationality. He should destroy this man's delusions with surgical precision, demonstrating to the audience how easily such fantasies could be dismantled by rigorous thinking. But the man's presence was unlike anything the professor had encountered before. There was no pleading in his voice, no desperate hunger for validation or attention. He spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had touched something beyond the material world, someone who had glimpsed a reality that transcended the boundaries of scientific materialism. The stadium held its breath as the homeless man slowly unfolded the crumpled paper. The paper was stained with coffee, rain, and what might have been tears. As the homeless man smoothed it against his leg, Professor Westbrook could see lines of handwriting scrawled across its surface, words written in the darkness of some shelter or street corner. The man's fingers traced the letters as if they were sacred text, and something in his reverence made the professor's skepticism waver for just a moment. "My name is Thomas," the man said, his voice carrying across the stadium with surprising clarity. "Thomas Hartley. 15 years ago, I was a professor too. Philosophy at Boston University. I had a wife, 2 children, a house in the suburbs. I had everything you have, Professor Westbrook, including the absolute certainty that God was a fairy tale for weak minds." The professor's breath caught in his throat. This was not what he had expected. The man was articulate, educated, familiar with the academic world. This was not some street preacher or religious fanatic. This was someone who had walked the same path, someone who had once stood where Daniel Westbrook now stood. Thomas continued, his eyes never leaving the professor's face. "I wrote papers debunking religious experience. I taught students that faith was evolutionary residue, a primitive coping mechanism that rational minds had outgrown. I was invited to conferences where I shared panels with people like you, where we congratulated ourselves on our intellectual courage and our refusal to bow to ancient superstitions." The crowd was completely silent now. Even the television cameras seemed to hold their breath as Thomas's story unfolded. Students leaned forward in their seats, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about for years to come. "But then my daughter died," Thomas said, and his voice cracked just slightly. "Leukemia. She was 7 years old. 7 years old, Professor Westbrook. And as I watched her waste away in that hospital bed, as I saw the light fade from her eyes, I felt something break inside me that I didn't even know existed." Professor Westbrook felt his hands trembling. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain emotionally detached from personal tragedies, to see them as inevitable consequences of living in a universe without purpose or meaning. But something in Thomas's voice, something in the raw honesty of his pain, was cutting through every intellectual defense he had built. "I threw myself into my work," Thomas continued. "I wrote angrier papers, gave more aggressive lectures. I needed to prove that her death meant nothing, that suffering was just random molecular activity, that there was no deeper purpose or plan. I needed to prove that grief was just neurons firing in patterns that evolution had programmed into us to increase our survival chances." The professor recognized the familiar territory of materialist philosophy, the comfortable explanations that had always provided him with certainty and control. But hearing them spoken by this broken man, seeing where that path had led, made them sound hollow and insufficient. "But the grief wouldn't go away," Thomas said. "It wasn't just neurons firing. It was something deeper, something that my philosophy couldn't touch or explain or heal. I started drinking. I started missing classes. I started screaming at students who dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there was more to existence than atoms and void." The professor's chest tightened. He had never lost a child, but he recognized the trajectory that Thomas was describing. He had seen brilliant colleagues destroyed by personal tragedies that their intellectual frameworks couldn't process. He had always assumed that such breakdowns were signs of weakness, failures of rational thinking. My wife left me, Thomas continued. She took our son and moved across the country. She said she couldn't watch me destroy myself anymore. She said the man she had married was gone, replaced by someone who was so afraid of feeling pain that he had stopped feeling anything at all. The words hit Professor Westbrook like physical blows. He thought of his own relationships, his own careful emotional distance, his own fear of vulnerability. He had always seen these as strengths, as evidence of his intellectual maturity. But Thomas's story was forcing him to consider the possibility that his emotional numbness might be a form of cowardice rather than courage. I lost my job, Thomas said. Started living on the streets. I told myself it was temporary, that I would get back on my feet once I figured out how to process what had happened. But the truth was, I was running from something I couldn't name, something that all my education and intelligence couldn't help me understand. The homeless man's voice grew stronger as he reached the climax of his story. And then last night, I had a dream. Not just any dream, Professor Westbrook. A dream so vivid, so real, that I woke up knowing it was more than just random brain activity during REM sleep. Professor Westbrook felt his scientific training kick in. Dreams were well-understood phenomena, nothing more than the brain's attempt to process information and emotions during sleep. They might feel meaningful to the dreamer, but they had no objective reality beyond the neural patterns that created them. But Thomas's eyes were blazing with conviction now. In this dream, I was standing in a place of incredible light. Not physical light, but something that seemed to illuminate not just my surroundings but my very soul. And I saw her there, Professor Westbrook. I saw my daughter. The professor's breath caught. He wanted to dismiss this as obvious wish fulfillment, as the desperate fantasy of a grieving father. But something in Thomas's voice, something in the absolute certainty of his conviction, made him hesitate. She was whole, Thomas continued. She was healthy and beautiful and filled with joy, and she spoke to me. She said, "Daddy, the man who taught you that I don't exist needs to know that I'm more real now than I ever was before." The stadium was so quiet that the professor could hear his own heartbeat. 20,000 people were holding their breath, waiting to see how this impossible moment would resolve itself. Thomas held up the crumpled paper, his hands no longer shaking. "She told me to come here today. She told me exactly what to say to you. And Professor Westbrook, she told me about your dream too." The professor's world tilted on its axis. He had never told anyone about the dream. The blood drained from Professor Westbrook's face as Thomas's words echoed through the stadium. The dream he had never spoken of, the dream that had haunted him for 3 nights running, the dream that had made him question everything he thought he knew about the nature of consciousness and reality. It was impossible that this stranger could know about it, impossible that anyone could have accessed the private theater of his sleeping mind. "You dreamed of a library," Thomas said, his voice carrying with supernatural clarity across the vast space. "An infinite library with shelves that stretched beyond the horizon. And in that library you found a book with your name on it. But when you opened it, all the pages were blank." Professor Westbrook's knees nearly buckled. The dream had terrified him in ways he couldn't articulate. He had dismissed it as anxiety about his upcoming book launch, as subconscious fears about his legacy and mortality. But the details Thomas was describing were exact, impossible, devastating. "You tried to write in the book," Thomas continued, his eyes locked on the professor's face. "You tried to fill those blank pages with your theories, your arguments, your proofs that God doesn't exist. But every word you wrote disappeared the moment you finished writing it. And then you heard a voice, didn't you, Professor? A voice that said, 'Knowledge without love is just noise.'" The professor's hands were shaking so violently that he had to grip the podium to remain standing. The voice in his dream had been unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the voice of his subconscious mind or some evolutionary echo. It was something other, something that seemed to come from beyond the boundaries of his materialist worldview. 20,000 students watched in stunned silence as their intellectual hero struggled to maintain his composure. The cameras captured every moment of his visible distress, every crack in the facade of certainty that had made him famous. Social media exploded with speculation and commentary, But inside the stadium, time seemed suspended. Thomas unfolded the paper completely now, revealing lines of text written in a careful, deliberate hand. She gave me the words to say to you, Professor Westbrook. The words that would help you understand what that dream really meant. The professor wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to flee from this impossible situation, to retreat to the safety of his office where he could analyze what was happening with the cold tools of rational thought. But something held him frozen in place, some recognition that this moment was a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. Your daughter, the professor whispered, his voice barely audible even with the microphone. She said something else in your dream, didn't she? Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. She said that the man who spent his life proving that love doesn't exist had forgotten how to love himself. She said that the man who taught thousands of students that consciousness is just an illusion had become an illusion himself. The words hit Professor Westbrook like a physical blow. He thought of his empty apartment, his non-existent relationships, his carefully constructed life that had room for everything except human connection. He had told himself that emotional detachment was a sign of intellectual maturity, that love was just a chemical reaction that clouded judgment and prevented clear thinking. But standing here in front of 20,000 people, facing this impossible encounter with a man who somehow knew his deepest secrets, he began to understand that his philosophical certainties had been prison walls rather than foundations of truth. Read it, the professor said, his voice stronger now. Read what she told you to say. Thomas lifted the paper, and his voice filled the stadium with words that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the material world. She said, "Tell him that his mind is a beautiful gift, but it was never meant to be a fortress. Tell him that the questions he's been asking are the right questions, but he's been looking for answers in the wrong places." The professor felt something breaking open in his chest, something that had been locked away for so long that he had forgotten it existed. It was not doubt exactly. It was something far more terrifying and wonderful. It was possibility. Tell him, Thomas continued, reading from the paper, that the universe is not a machine. It's a conversation. And the conversation isn't between atoms and void. It's between love and everything that resists love. Tell him that consciousness isn't an accident. It's an invitation. Professor Westbrook's worldview was crumbling, but instead of terror, he felt something that might have been relief. For 30 years, he had carried the burden of believing that existence was ultimately meaningless, that consciousness was a cosmic joke, that love was an evolutionary trick. The weight of that nihilism had been crushing, but he had worn it like a badge of honor. Now, for the first time in decades, he felt the possibility that there might be more to reality than the cold equations of materialist science. Not less truth, but more truth. Not less reason, but reason expanded to include dimensions of existence that his narrow philosophy had excluded. Thomas's voice grew stronger as he continued reading. Tell him that his students don't need him to destroy their faith. They need him to show them that faith and reason aren't enemies. They're dance partners. Tell him that the homeless man reading these words was once where he is now, and the professor listening to these words will soon be where the homeless man is now. The professor looked into Thomas's eyes and saw something that made his breath catch. He saw peace. Not the peace of someone who had given up on thinking, but the peace of someone who had found a way to think more deeply. Not the peace of intellectual surrender, but the peace of intellectual expansion. There's more, Thomas said, holding up the paper. She said this next part was specifically for you, Professor Westbrook. She said she knew you would need proof, and she wanted to give you something that would help you understand that this encounter is real. The professor's heart hammered against his ribs. He had built his entire career on the principle that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. Now he was being offered evidence of the extraordinary, and he was terrified of what it might mean. Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the stadium. She said to tell you about the letter. Professor Westbrook's world stopped spinning. The letter he had written to his deceased mother 5 years ago and hidden in his desk drawer. The letter he had never shown to anyone, never spoken of, never even admitted to himself that he had written. The letter had been written on a night when Professor Westbrook's famous certainty had cracked just enough to let loneliness seep through. His mother had died of Alzheimer's disease, and in her final months, she had forgotten everything except her faith. Even as her mind deteriorated, she had continued to pray, continued to speak of God with the unwavering confidence of someone who had touched something beyond the material world. He had mocked her faith, had tried to convince her that her prayers were just neurons misfiring in a damaged brain. But on the night she died, he had gone home to his empty apartment and written her a letter. In it, he had confessed his fear that his philosophical certainties were actually a form of cowardice, that his rejection of God was really a rejection of vulnerability, that his intellectual pride had cost him the ability to love and be loved. The letter had been his secret shame, evidence of what he saw as a momentary weakness in his rational armor. He had hidden it in his desk drawer, buried beneath academic papers and lecture notes, and had never spoken of it to anyone. It was impossible that Thomas could know about it. She said, Thomas continued, reading from the crumpled paper, that you wrote, "Mom, I'm sorry I couldn't believe in your God. I'm sorry I couldn't find the courage to hope that you still exist somewhere beyond the darkness. I'm sorry I chose the safety of despair over the risk of faith." The professor's legs gave out, and he sank into the chair behind the podium. The exact words. Thomas was quoting the exact words from a letter that existed only in his private desk drawer, a letter that no human eyes had ever seen. She said, Thomas continued, his voice filled with infinite compassion, that you ended the letter by writing, "If you can hear this, if there's any chance that consciousness survives death, please forgive me for teaching thousands of students that love is just chemistry and that you don't exist. Please forgive me for being too afraid to believe that there might be more to existence than atoms and void." 20,000 students witnessed their professor's intellectual foundations crumble in real time. The man who had built his career on the destruction of faith was being confronted with evidence that transcended every materialist explanation he had ever constructed. The cameras captured every moment of his transformation, every crack in his facade of certainty. But Thomas wasn't finished. He held up the paper, and his voice filled the stadium with words that seemed to come from beyond the boundaries of time and space. "She said to tell you that your mother heard every word of that letter. She said to tell you that your mother is proud of your brilliant mind, but she's been waiting for you to discover that brilliance without love is just elaborate emptiness." Professor Westbrook felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. It wasn't just doubt about his philosophical positions. It was something deeper, something that felt like awakening from a dream he hadn't realized he was dreaming. For 30 years, he had lived in a universe where consciousness was an accident, where love was a chemical reaction, where death was the final period at the end of existence. Now, confronted with knowledge that no materialist framework could explain, he was being invited to consider the possibility that the universe might be far more mysterious, far more beautiful, far more meaningful than his narrow philosophy had allowed. "The final thing she told me," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "was that this moment, this encounter, this impossible conversation, is your invitation to step out of the prison of certainty and into the adventure of faith. Not blind faith, Professor Westbrook. Faith that includes reason but isn't limited by it. Faith that embraces mystery without abandoning truth." The professor looked out at the sea of faces staring back at him. Students who had come to hear him destroy their faith were instead witnessing his own transformation. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his career teaching them that courage meant facing the harsh truth that existence was ultimately meaningless. Now he was discovering that true courage might mean facing the possibility that existence was more meaningful than he had ever dared to imagine. "I don't understand," he whispered into the microphone. "I don't understand how you could know these things. I don't understand how any of this is possible." Thomas smiled, and for the first time, the professor saw something in his face that transcended the years of suffering and homelessness. He saw joy, not the desperate happiness of someone clinging to delusions, but the deep joy of someone who had discovered that reality was far more wonderful than he had ever imagined. "Understanding isn't the first step, Professor," Thomas said gently. "Wonder is. And wonder is what happens when we stop trying to fit the infinite into the finite, when we stop trying to explain mystery away instead of marveling at it. The professor felt tears streaming down his face. He had not cried in 20 years, had trained himself to see emotional expression as weakness. But these tears felt different. They felt like the beginning of something rather than the end of something. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "What do I do with everything I've taught? Everything I've written? Everything I've built my life on?" Thomas folded the paper carefully, treating it like the sacred text it had become. "You don't throw it away," he said. "You expand it. You take all that brilliant reasoning and use it to explore the mystery instead of trying to eliminate it. You become a professor who teaches students that the universe is even more amazing than they imagined, not less." The homeless man who had somehow penetrated every layer of security, who had somehow accessed the professor's deepest secrets, who had somehow carried a message from a dead child to a man who had spent his life denying the possibility of such communication, began to walk toward the edge of the stage. "Wait!" the professor called out. "I have so many questions. I need to understand how this happened. I need to process what this means." Thomas turned back, his eyes filled with infinite patience. "The questions will come, Professor, and most of them will be answered, but not all at once. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being brave enough to live the questions." The stadium remained silent as Thomas disappeared into the crowd, leaving Professor Westbrook alone on the stage with 20,000 witnesses to his transformation. The man who had entered as Harvard's most celebrated atheist stood at the podium, forever changed by an encounter that his materialist worldview could never explain. In the days that followed, the video of the encounter went viral around the world. Scientists, philosophers, and theologians debated the implications of what had happened. Skeptics offered explanations ranging from elaborate hoax to psychological breakdown. Believers proclaimed it as evidence of divine intervention. But for Professor Westbrook, the debates and explanations mattered less than the simple truth that his life had been fundamentally altered. He canceled his book tour and spent the following weeks in his office, not writing angry critiques of religious belief, but wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. He reached out to theologians he had once debated, not to challenge their faith, but to understand it. He visited churches, synagogues, and mosques, not as an intellectual tourist, but as a seeker trying to understand what it meant to live with wonder instead of certainty. The letter he had written to his mother was still in his desk drawer, but now it felt less like a confession of weakness and more like a first step toward courage. He began to understand that his rejection of God had been less about intellectual honesty and more about emotional protection. He had been afraid to hope, afraid to love, afraid to believe in anything that might make his inevitable death more painful. But Thomas's message had shown him that the alternative to hope was not strength but emptiness. The alternative to love was not freedom but isolation. The alternative to faith was not truth but a smaller, sadder version of truth that left no room for mystery, meaning, or transcendence. His students noticed the change immediately. The man who had once taken savage pleasure in destroying their beliefs now challenged them to think more deeply about the nature of existence. He didn't become a preacher or abandon his commitment to rigorous thinking. Instead, he became a teacher who showed them that the universe was far more interesting when approached with humility instead of arrogance. "I used to think," he told his philosophy of religion class 6 months after the encounter, "that admitting the possibility of God was intellectual cowardice. I thought that truly brave thinkers had to face the harsh truth that existence was ultimately meaningless. But I've learned that it takes far more courage to live in a universe where consciousness might be more than an accident, where love might be more than chemistry, where death might not be the final word." He never saw Thomas again, despite searching the streets of Cambridge for months. But he didn't need to see him to know that the encounter had been real. The knowledge that no earthly explanation could account for, the transformation that had touched every aspect of his life, the peace that had replaced his angry certainty, these were evidence enough that reality was far more mysterious and beautiful than his narrow philosophy had allowed. The book he eventually wrote was titled The Expanded Mind: Faith, Reason, and the Adventure of Wonder. It became a bestseller, not because it offered easy answers, but because it invited readers to embrace the possibility that the universe might be far more meaningful than they had dared to imagine. It didn't argue for any particular religious tradition, but it made a compelling case that materialism was too small a philosophy for the vast mystery of existence. Professor Westbrook never became conventionally religious, but he became something more important. He became a man who had learned to live with wonder instead of certainty, with hope instead of despair, with love instead of intellectual pride. He had discovered that the choice was not between reason and faith, but between a reason that closed off possibilities and a reason that opened up infinite horizons. In quiet moments, he would sometimes take out his mother's letter and read it again. But now it felt less like a confession of weakness and more like a prayer that had finally been answered. Not in the way he had expected, but in the way he had needed. The homeless man had delivered a message that changed everything. The universe was not a machine, but a conversation. And Professor Daniel Westbrook had finally learned how to listen. As he stood before his students, no longer the man who had taught them that God was a delusion, but the man who had discovered that delusion was thinking any finite mind could contain the infinite mystery of existence, he understood that his real education had only just begun. The encounter in the stadium had ended, but the adventure of faith had just begun. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on your own journey, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Vault of Faith, and share it with someone who is searching for something deeper. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had a moment when faith became real for you? We read every message and would love to hear your story. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. But above all, keep the faith.